Now we come to our final major section of the book of Genesis, and that is the story of Joseph. As I've said before, we can really break Genesis down into three separate sections. The primeval history, chapters 1 through 11, which have their own internal logic. Then we had the two cycles, the cycle of Abraham and the cycle of Jacob. And these have a certain amount of internal structure, and much stronger perhaps in the story of Jacob than Abraham. But with both of those stories, we see many different pericope pulled together and given some structure and order. A structure, as I said, clearer in Jacob, but evident in both cycles. And now we come to the story of Joseph, a story that is much more what we could refer to as a novella. There's a consistent plot line through the story, and it builds to a climax much later in the story than what we found in Abraham or Jacob. So we have something that looks perhaps a little bit more like a modern short story, with the development of character and lots of different challenges through it. There are, of course, similarities with our other stories, but most scholars recognize Joseph to be something different, and hence we've got 37 through 50 as a third part of the book of Genesis. Now let's think about this story. Joseph, as I mentioned in the last lecture, has already been alluded to, and we saw that the turning point in the Jacob cycle was the birth of Joseph, whose name we could interpret to mean God has added to me. That God element, El, is left out of the name, but it's commonly understood to be a part of names, like what we hear in Israel. We could think of Yosef El, and Joseph would mean he adds. So perhaps God has added, and we certainly see the powerful addition of Joseph to Rachel, Jacob, and their family, and this motivation to go back to the Holy Land. So Joseph first emerges there, but has a very minor part until we come to this story of Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph will recall earlier stories that we have in Genesis and bring those up. But at the same time, we see some new elements within this story and some clearly defined elements. Perhaps the most important of those new elements, as far as I'm concerned, is the wisdom tradition. Now, there is not a scholarly consensus about this. Some will argue that there isn't much wisdom present in this story, but as a Franciscan, we always see the value of wisdom. We see wisdom as a good thing. St. Bonaventure wrote literally hundreds of pages on the wisdom tradition, especially in the book of Ecclesiastes. And wisdom is never a threat to us, as it is for some biblical commentators who get concerned that wisdom focuses on the wisdom of the world. And certainly Egypt was a seat of wisdom, and it's no accident that much of the Joseph story takes place there. So I'll argue that on top of many of the biblical points, there's also a wisdom story, a wisdom rooted in the ways of the earth that is part of this story as well. But before we get to that, we start in a very kind of normal family situation again. And as we've already seen in the struggles between Jacob and Esau, in the struggles between Cain and Abel, in the struggles between Sarah and Hagar, in the struggles between Leah and Rachel, there is much rivalry between brothers, between various wives, between people wanting to get ahead in terms of social status, which we often see among women, and what we see with men in terms of trying to control the land, trying to get a birthright, and trying to, in many respects, have the favor of the Lord. And so this dynamic now is present when we look at Joseph and his brothers. And this dynamic is added to, and the story is built up. And we can see elements in this story of the relationship between Abel and God. We know that God preferred Abel's gift. We know that there seems to be more love for God, for Abel, than Cain. And yet, love is never wrong. And we see that same situation happening in the Joseph story. Joseph is loved more by his father, and his brothers are cognizant of that, and jealousy happens as a result of this. And so, therefore, when Joseph receives this gift of a tunic, and we really can't be quite sure what exactly this tunic looked like, because similar language is used when we look at the tunics of women as well. But what we can be sure of was that it was a special tunic. It was something that evoked jealousy of others. When Joseph receives this gift, now we see the breakdown once again of shalom. And we see that word used very clearly. I believe it's in chapter 37, verse 4. And with the breakdown of shalom, we see that that is precipitated by a failure now to greet Joseph. His brothers don't want to talk to him. His brothers are angry, like Cain was angry, that they aren't receiving the same love as Joseph is experiencing. And so we see within that, once again, part of the mystery of human identity, of our various quirks, or perhaps things that ultimately lead to sin within our life, when we want what others have, when we can't accept the identity given to us by God, but lust after the identity given to other persons. And so this spirals out of control in the Joseph story. This manifests itself in a number of ways. We see a clear connection between Joseph and Jacob in the importance of dreams in both stories. Dreams will come to be the doing and undoing, and once again, the redoing, if that is even a word, of Joseph. Here in chapter 37, we see him describe two dreams. Now, when we try to understand dreams in the ancient world, we must remember that their understanding is different than our understanding, which has been colored so much by Freud. Freud would have us understand that dreams are a reflection of our experiences and how we kind of work out things that perhaps happened in the day or perhaps that are on our mind. And in the ancient world, dreams were seen to be given straight from God and a reflection of God. And so these dreams, which evoke powerful reactions, are still very honest kind of discussions or honest confessions of Joseph. The first dream, he talks about a sheaf of wheat and many other sheaves of wheat bowing down to him. And this is clearly him ascending above his brothers and his brothers needing to prostrate themselves to him. Obviously the brothers, he does not endear himself to the brothers through this dream. And then we get another dream in which there are stars and planets, and they too are acknowledging the greatness of Joseph, and they seem to be, in our terms, in his orbit. Now this dream is once again disliked by his brothers, but even the father remonstrates with Joseph after this dream, and the father challenges this dream. But we will see that the father remembers this dream, and this is ultimately the power of these dreams, that this is not Joseph on an ego trip, but rather this is God foreshadowing Joseph's role, and we as readers will always need to be cognizant of that. So ultimately now, Joseph has kind of been entrapped by his dreams, been entrapped by the clothes he's wearing, And he's living in a world without shalom, without peace. And his brothers are angry, and they ultimately find a way, as Joseph is sent down to the south of the promised land, to undo him. They have a murderous rage towards him, reminding us of Cain's murderous rage, perhaps reminding us also of Esau's murderous rage. But they ultimately decide to sell Joseph into slavery. And so with this sale, the story moves to Egypt, and Joseph moves to Egypt. And we get a sense, once again, in a different respect, of a story now that is a story a little bit of flight, a little bit of exile, and a little bit of what we referred to earlier as liminality, as Joseph is in a new place, removed from the customs that he knows, removed from the people that he knows. And in this new place, Joseph has new challenges. Once again, Joseph rises. Joseph's skills are acknowledged quickly. The love that Joseph engendered from his father and those around him in Israel is engendered quickly in Egypt. And so in chapter 39, we see that Joseph, the slave, quickly becomes, let's say, the chief slave, and really the chief administrative figure of a house, as slaves could have great power in the ancient world, second only to their masters, and in charge of vast wealth and given much security. But he was still a slave. And in this house, once again, we find Joseph being undone by clothing. The master's wife, Potiphar, takes an interest in Joseph, an amorous interest in Joseph, and she tries to find ways to seduce him. Joseph doesn't go down that route. Joseph will not allow himself to be seduced. But it's very interesting in this story, and this is kind of an element that we find from chapters 39 to 41, that there's a very strong wisdom component here. And so what we see here are that two reasons are given for why Joseph will not allow himself to be seduced. And the first reason is, I think, coming out of the wisdom tradition, that Joseph has an obligation to his master. Joseph has a relationship of trust, and he cannot break that trust. And that tells us something about the human condition, and that's a lesson for all people, whether they are religious or not, that our relationships are important. And then in verse 10, Joseph also mentions a religious reason for not doing this. But it's important to see that order. First, it's the trust of a relationship with another human being, and then it's his relationship with God. This is not a pattern that we normally find in the Bible, and so it's notable when we do find this pattern here in chapter 39. So Potiphar becomes insanely jealous, insanely angry with her love being rejected, and ultimately accuses Joseph of trying to rape her. As Joseph was scrambling around trying to avoid her, some of her clothing got left behind. And therefore this gown or this tunic, which caused so much problems in chapter 37 with his brothers, is now replaced by Potiphar's clothing, which proves his undoing. And the master naturally trusts his wife more than his slave, and so Joseph is thrown into jail. In jail, once again, Joseph's skills emerge. He cannot be kept down, and he turns to his dreams. He hears the dreams of a baker and a cupbearer, and successfully interprets those dreams. He sees that the cupbearer will go on to many great things within Egypt when he gets out of jail, but the baker is doomed. And he forthrightly and honestly tells them what's going to happen to them. Those things happen, and Joseph only asks that the cupbearer remember him. Well, Joseph spends many years in jail, but ultimately that story continues. And the cupbearer, in a time of great hardship, is able to help, or is able to remember Joseph. And Pharaoh now is having many dreams. And Pharaoh can't quite understand what's going on in those dreams. And we see that Joseph emerges. The cupbearer tells Pharaoh about this experience, and Pharaoh comes to, and Joseph comes to Pharaoh, and Joseph is able to understand these dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams, and as a good administrator. So once again, we have this element of the wisdom tradition with us. We see that Joseph is able to give a strong administrative path for the Pharaoh to take. So we see this core to the story, and it's a very human core, that our gifts and our talents can be our doing and our undoing. And we can't necessarily control all those things. But when we recognize God's gifts in our life, when we develop those gifts, seemingly in this story, definitely, God reemerges through those gifts. So those gifts can get us in trouble, and those gifts can lead to arrogance, those gifts can lead to problems in our lives. But at the same time, we can develop them and we can use them for good as we grow and mature and develop. And so we see this perhaps not quite so clearly in the Joseph story, as God seems to always be working through Joseph. But Joseph maintains his gifts. Joseph uses these gifts of dream interpretation in chapter 37 with these baker and cupbearer, and now with Pharaoh. And this gift then brings Joseph to a place of great prominence within Egypt. So we see then that the Lord works in this situation, and that we find some very important points. So if we turn back to chapter 39, once again, we have this element of the wisdom tradition present, which I think is very strong, but we also have an overlay of God's goodness and God's favor. It's an overlay at times that's not quite as apparent in our English translations. But if we look at chapter 39 at two different areas, we'll see that. So chapter 39 verse 2 reads, "But since the Lord was with him, Joseph got on very well and was assigned to the household of his Egyptian master." That can also be more literally translated as Joseph found favor or found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And clearly we're talking about the Lord God, not the Lord of the house. And then in verse 21, we hear, "The Lord remained with Joseph. He showed him kindness by making the chief jailer well disposed towards him." This word kindness brings up another very important Hebrew word, chesed. This chesed is kind of connotes a faithful companionship, a binding that we'll find the Lord wants with his people, and that comes up many, many other times throughout the Old Testament. So in this wisdom story, we also very much see the workings of the Lord, the language of the Lord, and kind of enmeshed almost perfectly in this story of both wisdom and God's grace active in Joseph's life. So this now has led Joseph to a place of great importance with Pharaoh, and this now will lead ultimately to reconciliation. We find this reconciliation to be a long road, and it starts in chapter 42. It becomes stronger in chapter 44, and ultimately comes to its climax in chapter 45. But we have an element in this story that I think too often gets overlooked. We find with the brothers that they're fairly kind of odious characters. They hate their brother. They sell him into slavery. And oftentimes the brothers aren't thought any more about than that. But I would like to point out that we see development in the characters of the brothers. And this is a development that too often goes unnoticed, or most commentators really don't reflect on too much. But both in chapter 42 and 44, we find that the brothers understand that something needs to give, that part of their past life must be recognized and must be made whole again. Once again, back maybe to this concept of shalom. There's a need for shalom, which can mean peace, but can also mean wholeness within their lives. And so chapter 42 begins, as a number of chapters have in the Old Testament, or a number of episodes have. It begins with famine, and there's famine once again in the Holy Land. And so this causes the need for the brothers to go to Egypt, and ultimately to return to Joseph. Not being aware of that, as they don't know where he was sold to. So the brothers head off to Egypt, and there's a sense of kind of they're ill at ease, a sense of discomfort, a sense that something could go wrong here. And also we know that Jacob is very concerned about them heading off, and he doesn't want to lose another son, as has happened in the south before. And the brothers recognize that they've done something wrong, and they can't quite articulate it all, but we see a sense of conversion coming into this story. And so, in many respects, this story is a story of wisdom. This story is a story of Joseph's ascent to power. And this story is the conversion of his brothers, an element that I think has been left out. So we find in 42 that they come and, unbeknownst to them, they meet with Joseph. Joseph has become a new man. Joseph has a new name, an Egyptian name. Joseph has a new wife, Asenath. And Joseph has become thoroughly of another culture. But of course he can still understand his mother tongue. He recognizes his brothers, and he starts putting them to tests. So Joseph has a sense that God has been with him through all of this. And we hear that very much in the story, that God has placed Joseph in these positions for a larger reason. Joseph's brothers obviously don't have a sense of that and don't know what's going on. And so they're terrified through these different tests. At one time, Joseph sends them home, wanting to hold on to one of his brothers, and puts a cup in their bags of grain. So it would appear that they have stolen it. The brothers are terrified. But they're forced to go back down to Egypt again as the famine worsens. They don't know what's going to happen. They know that they've been kind of stuck with and look like robbers. So they're very, very scared in chapters 43 and 44. But we hear in chapter 43, verse 21, I believe, a very important sense of Joseph trying to find and help them. And we hear this expression that Joseph says to them, "Rest assured." Now that "rest assured" in English doesn't sound like it has this great sense of peace, but it is using the word shalom in an idiomatic expression in Hebrew. So shalom emerges again in this story. We see that the shalom, I think, that we've been asked to use in order to be in the image and likeness of God, now is coming up again and again in these stories, has marked the growth of Abram to Abraham, has marked the growth of Jacob to Israel. And here is marking the growth not of Joseph, who has remained a stellar character throughout, but is marking the growth of the brothers, as they are told to be aware of shalom and to allow shalom to drive them. So in chapter 43, we see the introduction once again of this theme. And then in chapter 44, we see a final test. And these tests now are something that we have become conscious of and that we've seen. We've seen Abraham's test in chapter 22. We've seen other tests of Jacob as he tries to come back to the Holy Land. In a minor way, we saw the test in a very dissimilar story that I alluded to, I believe, in the first lecture, of Jacob and his relationship with Tamar, where Jacob needs to acknowledge that God is working through Tamar and not him, Tamar who has had to work as a prostitute. So we see this then coming in chapter 44. There's a great terror with this final test, as there are many accusations against the brothers. They know that they are truly innocent here, that they haven't stolen, that they do not deserve to be thrown into jail. But on the other hand, they know that their lives are not lives of complete innocence. And perhaps they are finally receiving their just deserts for that horrendous act that they did in chapter 37. And so we see a greater conversion here in the brothers as they face a great injustice in chapter 44, but they don't use it as a time and as a way to simply seek vengeance, simply grow in hatred, simply disown any responsibility for it. But instead, they can see that there is a balance in life, and that they have altered that balance. They have altered that shalom. They have not always been just. They have not always acted through tzedakah. And therefore, the story kind of tells us about this conversion. So the story ends, or begins its conclusion, its dramatic conclusion, in in chapter 45, where we see that Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. The brothers are initially scared, but Joseph is able to bring some conclusion to this. Joseph is able to reassure them. Joseph is able to kind of act in this fashion in which he tells them that he has always been moving in the direction that God wants him to move. Whether Joseph liked it or not, God has been part of all this, and God has ultimately placed Joseph in Egypt to ensure the survival of the Israelites. Joseph can understand this in his life. And we see that the brothers in chapters 42 and 44 have come to understand that they need to look at their lives and accept responsibility for the evils they have done. I think this is a call to all of us to look at the wholeness of our lives, to understand God at work in many different respects. We will find ourselves at times simply innocent and having to suffer for no good reason. And of course we know that God never wants us to suffer. This is not God's design in our lives. But at the same time, if, like the brothers, we can look at our lives in its wholeness, we'll see that perhaps we have made mistakes. Perhaps we have not always been innocent. Perhaps we can look past the evils being done to us in order to find reconciliation in our lives, in order to have a sense of justice and peace that can't be altered by the evils that others do to us, but that we can see are part of life, and that we are called to, at times, accept when we cannot change them, and not allow them to change us into hateful people. The brothers have overcome this, and have stopped being hateful people, as they have seen the totality of God's work in their lives. With this final kind of reconciliation between the brothers, now Jacob comes back into the story. And we see this in a very dramatic sense. We see two very beautiful scenes filled with irony. Jacob comes back, ultimately comes down to Egypt. He's convinced that his son's there, and this drives him towards wanting to see his son again. We see that Jacob extends a blessing to the Pharaoh. And this is very important for us too in our understanding of the Bible, because we see that the blessing that Jacob worked so hard for, that he stole from his brother, that defines the whole Jacob cycle, is not a blessing just for Jacob. It's not a blessing just for his sons. It's not a blessing just for Israel. It's a blessing for the whole world, and it's a blessing that Pharaoh receives. And this we have to keep in mind as we think about Egypt and as we think about the other nations. At times, they will produce great evil. At times, they will enslave. At times, they will be the source of nothing but trouble. But the Bible always maintains a balanced view, always lets us hear the voices of the minority. And in this blessing, we are reminded that Egypt can be a source of good. Egypt can be a place of refuge, as well as a house of bondage. The second ironic scene that we find is that Joseph now wants a blessing for his sons from Jacob. And it's a blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, who will fill out the 12 tribes of Israel. And in this situation, Joseph decides that he wants his second son to receive the first son's blessing and arranges the hands to do that. But now the converted Jacob, the Israel, the Jacob who has caused so much suffering by trying to rearrange blessings, rearranges this blessing and makes sure that the first son receives his blessings in spite of what Joseph has tried to do. So with this story now of Joseph, we see many new elements added to our biblical picture that we must reflect on and ask some questions about. I think most important, we must ask, what is the role of wisdom within our lives and the lives of our biblical characters? What are the major themes within this story of Joseph? Should we be threatened by, at times, the secular emphasis in this story? Or can we integrate all of this into how God acts in our lives? And finally, we're called once again to remember that there's a collective sense to these characters, that not all our characters are simple individuals, but they tell us about the survival of Israel, about the survival of faith, a faith that ultimately points to a God who wants hesed, who wants to have loving kindness with us.